Hey guys, how is everybody today? Good to see you. We've got here me, Jennifer Hynes, Nick, Antonio, and Jim, and we're going to take a deep dive tonight into the IPCC and their latest findings and how they compare to what we've been saying pretty much all along for a long time. So welcome, Nick, Jim, and Antonio. So good to see you today. How are you doing?
Hey, Jen.
I'm
Good. How are you?
Hey guys. Hey
Doing
Nick.
good.
Antonio, good to see you guys again. And
You
good
too,
to see you,
Jim.
Jen.
Yeah, good to see you. So, in no particular order, if you were going to summarize the findings in this latest report with the IPCC, either Nick, Jim, or Antonio, what would you say briefly their tone was compared to previous reports in these findings?
Yeah, I'll take on
Well,
the summary since I was the guy that focused mainly on the summary for policymakers. But in this latest report, overall, the feeling of the report is obviously a little bit more stark than the AR5. Of course, it's not anywhere close to what us fine people might be more aware of the situation, but they actually go in a little bit more detail about the impacts that we're already assigned to, many of the climate impacts that we've already been seeing around the world in terms of heat waves, droughts, wildfires, sea level rise, and also extreme hydrological events as well. So the report is stark, but it doesn't also bring anything new to the table in particular. So in that sense, while the report is more stark than they've ever been, which has kind of been, let's say, the history of the IPCC getting more stark as the years go on, it still tells us, and we'll talk about this a little bit later as we break into the chapters, that we still have a carbon budget to keep global temperatures to 1.5 degrees. And according to some of those targets, we still have a 50 to 66% chance of doing so. So that kind of gives you a little summation about the climate report that, yes, we are taking on impacts now. Yes, those impacts are still quite severe and serious and going to get worse. But there is hope that we have still a significant chance if we take the right pathway to at least achieve 1.5 degrees.
Well, it's good. There's always a chance, I imagine. Not sure that we've really shown any inkling that we'll take a chance like that. What about you, Nick? What did you think about the findings in the report and the overall scope and tone of the latest report?
From what I've gleamed at it, I mean, I have to agree with Antonio. I didn't really do anything new or talk about anything new. They did, obviously, the focus was on dealing with issues and vulnerability and adaptation, and discuss the means that could be done to face those challenges. It's just a matter of governments being willing to actually face those challenges and truly understanding. And I mean, part of the problem is, and we can go into this in more detail after you read the article you wanted to read or go over a little bit more, Jennifer. But I mean, does climate change? The concerns related to climate change are the disasters and catastrophes that will increase because of climate change. That will both and humanitarian crises that will result because of climate change. It's those impacts and damage to both the social and economic and environmental systems. But the issues that go around those that crop up in disasters and catastrophes are pre-existing conditions in societies already. They're day-to-day affairs, day-to-day issues that then bleed over into the disaster context when you have these events happen, whether it be, smaller events or the Hurricane Katrina type events. Those things, pre-existing issues with poverty and other socioeconomic issues and political issues and issues of race and ethnicity, in terms of discriminatory behavior towards different groups of people that affect their ability to be successful more in society, then bleed over into those disasters and catastrophes when people suffer the most. Those people suffer the most when you have those events. And so we talk a lot about being able to make our societies more adaptive and resilient. We can kind of talk about what those terms actually mean or may mean, but ultimately it means addressing systemic problems in those societies that politicians generally don't care about, because they're the ones either from the majority racial ethnic group or from they're bought off by the rich that don't care about other people or about climate change or about anything that they perceive as hurting those lesser than them, inferior to them. And you see that in U.S. society, you see that throughout the Western world, throughout everywhere. Those issues exist. So, it's interesting that this is being addressed. It's good that it's being addressed on paper, but a lot still needs to be done in reality, because even if we take the outlook that the future is grim in terms of actually being able to prevent some of the worst impacts of climate change, I would always prefer that society did better to reduce carbon emissions and all that other stuff. But if you're going to talk about actually trying to adapt your society to climate change, is already coming or happening now, that is almost as steep of a climb as trying to get emissions reduced. It involves doing transformative things that just are not being done at all, and it's very sad to watch, but it's just not being done at all, because those in power are typically put in power, funded by people that don't care, because they perceive that doing so would mean caring for those that they shouldn't have a right to care about, even though it ultimately will affect them as well. Climate change shows no mercy to anyone, but those with less money, less resources, or perceived to be inferior to them in some way, racially, ethnically, or otherwise, are the ones to hurt first. So that's who they don't want to address those kind of structural problems that would actually help people survive longer in a warming world with more disasters and catastrophes. So that's basically the take that I got out of it. And we can talk more about it as the show progresses.
Yeah.
Well,
Thank you.
well, what I was struck by in this report was and Antonio Hurdy alluded to this, was the bluntness of their findings, the starkness. They described basically the damages, the stresses, that ecosystems are put under. They did address food vulnerability, water scarcity. They call it food insecurity. Let's just call it what it is: people going hungry. Okay, no euphemisms, please. But the other thing that I found interesting is that just even a few years ago, scientists tended to be reticent about saying, "Well, this event is due to climate change." Always been reticent about that. Now they're not being so reticent. Now they're basically saying, "Yeah, what we're seeing is climate change. Climate change is directly, causing what's going on, be it, more intense storms, heat bombs, right? Precipitation bombs, that fire bombs, we now have, pyrocumulus clouds, so we're seeing the scientific community basically no longer really holding back punches.
Mhm.
So I found that to be interesting. It's just noting the ecological damages that they described and summarized in the report, and how it's going to play out, what's going to be, under the different warming scenarios, how will things proceed. Um, I thought was laid it out there for all to see that we do have a climate crisis now on our hands, as far as, for the viability of human society and civilization going forward.
Yeah,
Totally.
absolutely. It's as if what we've been saying all these years, it's finally starting to come to fruition, and they acknowledge it in 6 big findings from the IPCC 2022 report on climate impacts, adaptation, and vulnerability. So I just want to cover what their findings were real quick. I probably won't read the entire article, but just kind of summarize what they saw, and then maybe we can take a deep dive into that. So, the newest report from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change paints a troubling picture. Climate change is already impacting every corner of the world, and much more severe impacts are in store if we fail to have greenhouse gas emissions this decade and immediately scale up adaptation. Following the first installment of the IPCC's sixth assessment report, Working Group 2 contribution, released February 28th, 2022, draws from 34,000 studies. It involves 270 authors from 67 countries. It's really wide in scope, it's vast. It provides one of the most comprehensive examinations of the intensifying impacts of climate change and future risks, particularly for resource poor countries and marginalized communities. The 2022 IPCC report also details which climate adaptation approaches are most effective and feasible, as well as which groups of people and ecosystems are most vulnerable. UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres called the report an atlas of human suffering and a damning indictment of failed climate leadership. Holy crap. I mean, they're reaching a breaking point. That's pretty bleak, right? So, just very briefly, these are the 6 takeaways from this report. Number 1, climate impacts are already more widespread and severe than expected. So, climate change is already causing widespread disruption in every region of the world, with just 1.1 degrees C of warming. So, we're already seeing withering droughts, extreme heat, record floods, and food security problems. This threatens the livelihoods of millions of people. We've also seen since 2008 devastating floods and storms forcing 20 million people from their homes each year. Since 1961, crop productivity growth in Africa shrunk by a third. So you can see where this is going. It's like, it's bleak. It's really bleak. Then number 2, We are locked into even worse impacts from climate change in the near term. So, this is the bleak truth. Even if the world rapidly decarbonizes, greenhouse gases already in the atmosphere and current emission trends will make some very significant climate impacts unavoidable through 2040. In other words, it's baked in the cake already. The IPCC estimates that in the next decade alone, climate change will drive 32 to 132 million more people into extreme poverty. Global warming will jeopardize food security as well as increase the incidence of heat-related mortality, heart disease, and mental health challenges. So that's pretty bleak. It's like there's more to come. Number 3, risks will escalate quickly with higher temperatures, often causing irreversible impacts of climate change. So there's something here I just wanted to go over, Sandy. There's a little graph in here. It says, it's the blue one, comparing risks from rising temperatures. And what it basically kind of maps out, if the world is at 1.5, what happens in all these different categories at 2.C and at 3C. And what really struck out at me was fires. So fires are going to be up to 187 times worse than they are today. So that is huge. And that says, you know, across the Mediterranean, Europe, but I mean, you know, everywhere. So, you know, fires, extreme heat, that is what is pretty much already baked in the cake. It's just how high will it go? Then number 4, inequity, conflict, and development challenges heighten vulnerability to climate risk. So right now, 3.3 billion to 3.6 billion people live in countries highly vulnerable to climate impacts, with global hotspots concentrated in several places around the world. So we can see more conflict coming out of this, unfortunately. Then number 5, adaptation is crucial. Feasible solutions already exist. More support must reach vulnerable communities. So they're trying to find ways to do adaptation, like social programs that improve equity and justice, ecosystem-based adaptation, new technologies and infrastructure. And then the 6th point is, but some impacts of climate change are already too severe to adapt to. The world needs urgent action now to address losses and damages. And that's kind of a damning acknowledgement that we've really already gone too far, even such as it is. And things are not going to go back to the way that they are. So net, that, yeah, that, yeah, bummer.
Well,
Then include
I'm sorry, Ben. Go ahead.
what? And no. Please, Antonio, jump in.
Yeah, I was going to say maybe this is a good time to actually talk a little bit about the shared socioeconomic pathways that the IPCC tries to depict in order for us to have an idea of where we are going. Sandy, can you bring up the graph on the SSPs? So this is also the new type of model that the IPCC uses in this latest assessment report. In the past, they used the RCPs, the representative concentration pathways, but the RCPs were too, let's say, physical that they were only modeling the science, as it were, whereas the SSPs actually talk about the different human factors that impact our decisions on climate change. And some of those decisions are obviously mostly socio-political, economic. Some of the things that Nick was hinting around about earlier in his conversation. But essentially, these SSPs overlay the representative concentration pathways. That is, that the usual scenarios that we're used to are now qualified by political socio activities. So the different type of policies that we enact. So here, the IPCC says that essentially we are on SSP 7.0, so just below what might be, the equivalent to representative concentration pathway 8.5 or SSP 8.5. So according to the IPCC, we're currently on the lighter red color solid line in the shaded red area. So yeah, the cursor is on the correct one. So essentially what this is saying is that we're not doing exactly business as usual, but we are essentially doing business as usual. This is saying that some policies have been taking place, but you also have to understand, for people who are at home trying to wrap their head around what do all these different models mean, the best way to think about SSP 7.0 is thinking about we're at the lower bound of RCP 8.5. We're at the lower bound of the worst case scenario. But instead of just talking about it in terms of atmospheric concentration of CO2 in the air, what the IPCC also tries to do here is talk about it in terms of what humans are doing relative to that concentration. So this way, we try to understand some of the socio-political, economic dynamics of the forces that are putting those concentrations in the atmosphere. So in some sense, I do applaud the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, because this has been their most extensive work yet to try to understand, let's say, the human feedback factor.
Well, one thing that I am seeing a lot more now in the research papers being published is that they're using the 8.5, because quite bluntly, that's what the data best fits that. So you're going to use the model that's closest to what that fits the data. The IPCC is saying that, oh, it's worse than we thought, or it's happening sooner than we thought. Well, yes, that really shouldn't come as a surprise, given for how many years they've always assumed a linear increase versus exponential. So basically, in my view, what they admitted to was that their modeling in the past was incorrect.
Mm-hmm. I mean,
So,
and
and another thing,
that's what I've always felt when I've looked at these different pathways that they present, Jim, and they always give kind of like if we get our act together this way, in the worst case scenario, we've always tracked to the worst case scenario without exception, which means
yeah.
they're not estimating it right and their models are wrong, like you say.
Well, it's not. I don't think it's that the models are wrong. It's that the objectives of the model is not the same as reading the totality of climate change. So the objective of the model is to simply understand what are the outputs of human inputs. So these models do not, if you can actually tell, I mean, the most aggressive models here are super linear. The climate does not respond necessarily super linearly. We know that. But what these models are meant to do is to tell human policymakers, if you put 450 parts per million of CO2 in the atmosphere, we're roughly going to get somewhere between 1.5 to 2 degrees. But it doesn't say, but if we get 1.5, 2 degrees, it's going to trigger this amount of feedback. Because these models explicitly exclude those type of variables. The underlining models that are the basis for the SSPs and the RCPs are the magic models. And the magic, and that's 2 C's, not K, the magic models are meant to interpret, just think about it as a very simplified version of the atmosphere. If you put this much greenhouse gas in the Earth's atmosphere, this is what happens atmospherically. But not necessarily this is what's going to happen in terms of dynamically calculating feedback. If you want models that try to interpret feedback dynamics, you're going to have to look at the CIMP, or the coupled carbon intercomparison model project. The CIMPs do a much better interpolation of feedback dynamics into the future. And it's also their goal to try to also understand both the human inputs, but also the feedbacks that will happen as a response. Whereas that's not true with the underlying magic models that are simply looking at the anthropogenic forcing.
Mm-hmm. It seems that there are
Yeah,
just more and more feedback relationships, and as they become aware of them, they try and retrofit all those feedbacks into the models. But there's so much complexity and feedbacks causing feedbacks, and so their models never seem to track to the most aggressive track that we find ourselves on. Yeah, Nick.
Well,
I just
yeah, and I was just
go ahead, Nick.
I was just I was just going to add that with the the IPCC is trying to sort of attempt a little bit in this report, just glancing over some of the impacts, is that they're taking what Antonio's going into more into the going beyond just how much carbon is in the atmosphere and how much temperature you're gonna get. They're trying to take a more of a systems based approach to explaining what's going on, which is more traditionally in disaster science. We look at systems theory, which you could talk, which can discuss the effects on the built environment, the human social environment, and the natural environment. And if you get disasters and catastrophes as a result of disruptions in those systems, and you can go even deeper into socio political ecological theory, which actually will go more in detail about human vulnerability and social economic issues and political problems and various types of vulnerabilities. And basically not only with humans, but also the environment that humans depend on. So when you start influencing or changing, particularly rapidly changing a aspect of the natural environment, which in this case is through climate change, anthropogenic climate change, you can end up with these very nonlinear or potentially chaotic effects, responses in the systems. So you could have these feedback loops that are very nonlinear and hard to measure, hard to quantify. You can end up with very rapid socio-political problems where governments that are unable to handle the stresses from the rapid changes in the natural environment fail, and that can lead to major um, um, both social and ecological catastrophes. With say a drought can cause a major famine that leads to warfare. I mean, a big potential example of this is what happened in Syria in the late 2000s and early 2010s with drought, prolonged drought that led to a weakening of the government that led to civil war and then to a complex humanitarian crisis and a large scale migration of people to another continent that then caused all sorts of socio-political issues in those countries. What were we going to do with these people? Should we let them in? There was issues with racism and ethnic preference. So you have all sorts of these issues that can crop up very, very quickly when you have these climate changes. You just change one system, and that puts the people that are most at risk of harm in direct line of fire, and then all of this whole domino effect occurs. So, I mean, climate change is not just about more heat, more fire, more stuff. Those are the hazard events, but it's all the accumulating and cascading impacts on ecological and human systems that end up being the biggest driver of all the problems for civilization because of climate change.
And thing I could want to add at this point is, and Nick and Antonio have been, basically alluding to this, is we having climate refugees, and what basically a result of what's happening is that there's going to be large and larger chunks of land. It's going to become uninhabitable. It just becomes too hot, too dry, whatever the conditions are makes these lands uninhabitable. People are going to be fleeing en masse and go to wherever. So then when you looking at it from a population ecological aspect, you're going to have same number of people and perhaps more because humans are still you know increasing our numbers in an exponential manner. So now you're going to have more and more people, but you're going to be trying to put them onto less and less available land. So then and you need to set aside land to house the people, but also to produce food. And this is going to put in a tremendous strain on the system, and also it's been documented and quantified now that higher temperatures are reducing crop yields, and the crops that are harvested, the nutritional content is drastically reduced. So you're not going to get, say, the caloric requirements. So that means that people may have to eat more food to get the same caloric requirements than they did before. I'm also seeing studies that are looking at the interaction of various tipping elements. And the overall result was quite stark. What they found in these papers is when they examine all these different interactions is that a temperature increase of 1.3 C is really going to start heralding in some major disastrous events that's going to lead to the climate refugees and more land, either becoming flooded out continuously or dried out, and then you're at risk of fires, etc., etc. So their assessment, in essence, was that the tipping elements working together is going to basically really dramatically increase the deleterious impacts. And if you think what's happening now is bad, you ain't seen nothing yet. Is the message that these papers are sharing? So it's extremely alarming. There's just no other way around it.
Yeah. And speaking of refugees, I mean, just because, when the system is completely strained, we have this Ukrainian war and conflict causing there to be millions of refugees, of people running out of their homes that they never thought that they would have to leave and go to Poland or someplace else and try and escape this madman. So you have insanity compounded with, you know, geopolitical tension and climate tension, and it's all kind of colliding together. And yeah, it can't
Well,
end well.
this whole Ukrainian thing is a bit personal to me because I have friends,
Oh,
close friends in both Ukraine and Russia. And,
Oh,
so they're sending me videos and photos of, a friend of mine, uh, you know, her husband's gone off to fight. A shell basically obliterated her apartment. I mean,
mm,
it's just stuff like that. Y- And
mm,
and these are I see the photos, and these are places I've been to, and and it's just like it to see the destruction is just horrifying. I mean, I'll look at a photo. Oh, I know what that is. Oh my God, look at it now, and I remember how it was. It's
mm,
they're scared. They're running out of food, water. They're trapped and encircled. I mean, they're blowing up residential buildings and bombing maternity hospitals. It's just absolute insane bullshit. Excuse me, but it
mm,
just is. And for what reason? Oh, we don't want Ukraine joining the EU. We want Ukraine is not a
mm,
real country. It has to be part of Russia Empire. Come on. But
yeah.
that neither here nor there. But yeah, it's a bit personal for me.
Oh, it's just absolutely horrendous. And this is going to affect everything else as well, because it's going to add to the overall instability and stresses and feelings
Well,
of
look,
terror.
yeah, I mean, look at the government's responses. Hey, we have to increase production of fossil fuel so we can cut off Russia from selling their fossil fuel. It's the exact wrong response. Although to be fair, some European countries are basically saying, well, we need to accelerate the green energy program. Okay, good, but in the short term, we're seeing what? Let's accelerate, fossil fuel production.
Mhm.
it's
Absolutely.
very interesting to see kind of how each year unfolds, right? Because although the Ukrainian crisis has nothing to do, with climate change directly, all of its implications certainly do. And of course, one of the big implications coming out of this is what does it mean for the so-called transition? Our country is going to, well, first of all, oil and energy prices have soared across the world. Just the market effects of that are going to have some push toward, alternatives, just basic, capitalistic economics. But also, you have, just as Jim Massa said, the oil industry always trying to make a profit from war. Of course, building new terminals takes 3 to 4 years on average. So even if we had a quote unquote build out, the crisis could completely subside before the end, before these terminals would even come online. So the idea that we need a drill, drill, drill and that's somehow going to alleviate the crisis today or tomorrow or next month or in 6 months or in 12 months is ridiculous. But this is the reality of geopolitics. One thing that does assure me, which is assuring that comes out of this, is look how we were able to maneuver and calibrate the financial system to harm Russia. And what that tells me is that when the political will is there, we could really seriously finance the transition if that was something that we cared about. But I guess we don't. But in other news, we have in the United States put together a $1.5 trillion war package responding to the crisis in Ukraine. And this was just on the death of the Build Back Better package, which correspondingly $1 trillion or so dollars. So almost dollar for dollar transfer straight to the war economy and away from transition. So that should tell you a little bit about how we are responding to these crises.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I
It
can
also
have
tells
something to
you
say about
about
that. I mean, this is a. I was just gonna say, this is an issue in the emergency management world in general. Most emergency management stuff in the government is focused on preparedness and response activities, and response being just like the immediate actions to protect life, property, and the environment, and preparedness, the readiness for response, and preferably recovery too. But recovery and mitigation are phases of emergency management that are very weakly addressed, and even preparedness itself is, as a concept, is poorly understood in terms of like what actually goes into that at different levels of society. And so because of the focus on like trying to respond to events and to have some usually meager preparation for them, there's very little that goes into helping societies recover from disasters and become more the talk of resilience and adaptation, and say the IPCC report. There's very little that goes into actually trying to do things to reduce risk from hazard events, because that requires a level of forward thinking. You have to be able to think not only about next month or whatever, but next year, 10 years from now, 30 years from now, and about what you need to have in place so that when something could go wrong, you've reduced the risk of it being so bad that you're unable to handle it and actually be able to maintain the social, political, ecological states, or even improve upon them. That doesn't get addressed at all because it requires a level of forward thinking that most politicians don't have. I mean, authoritarian regimes don't care a lot about people at all, but even in democratic societies, they're a lot of times have short-term interests that relate to just their election, and those issues just don't get addressed. And that's an issue all around the world, and governments all around the world. And obviously, the big business being oil, as it is, they still have tons of money that they can do to lobby and influence politicians to prevent those mitigation, those risk reduction strategies from being addressed and implemented that could affect their bottom line. So,
yeah, and ironically, with the soaring, price of oil per barrel, I mean, they're now projecting like at least 185 by summer or something like that. This actually helps a certain leader in Russia fund his war. It won't be until whether how soon the sanctions can really. The sanctions are already hitting the ordinary Russian citizen very, very hard, and I had problems with that because they didn't ask for this. They didn't want this war, but it won't be until the price of oil per barrel tanks to like 25, $18 a barrel, will then Putin run out of money to fund this this craziness. So this is going to go on for quite some time. It seems to me he's determined to do to Ukraine what he did to Chechnya. But again, it's just driving more and more oil production because countries are not they're banning the import of Russian gas, oil, whatever. So now they're going to increase their production. And as Antonio said, so excellently a moment ago, it doesn't come online like now. It's going to take years, to get those facilities up and running. So if you're going to do that, you might as well do the aggressive, be equally aggressive and implement green technology. Divert the funding that way. So, spot on, Antonio. Quite blunt.
Mhm.
And I hate to put on my oceanographer hat again, but in all these reports, I still see, what's going on in the oceans really not being given full due consideration. And mainly what I'm talking about is, you can think of the oceans right now as a big battery, big capacitor with all this stored up, pent up energy that's just waiting to discharge to the atmosphere, all that heat energy, all that carbon dioxide that we don't see this being really accounted for. And it's happening. You're going to get this massive flux, and any mitigation effects or whatever, it's going to be swamped by when this heat starts diffusing back to the atmosphere. And at that point, it's almost like, as James Hansen has said, it's basically like a game over. And
Oh my God.
let's not forget that a lot of population biologists do opine that an increase of 4C is is sufficient to, if not cause human extinction, cause a massive reduction in the numbers of people on the planet. James Lovelock himself has stated that it would not surprise him if there was only 2 billion people at most left by, say, 2070 or so. That's 50 years away. So it really comes down to basic ecological principle of carrying capacity, and humans is way above carrying capacity for the planet.
Mhm.
It's really when all the things we discussed tonight thus far, all the the human actions, the human tolls, and so on. When you come right down to it, the system is not sustainable. It just is not. And I think we are now seeing the beginnings of it breaking.
Mhm. I agree with you, Jim. I think that we've reached so many thresholds and we have crossed them, and our extreme hubris as a species at large, kind of the collective conscious karma of humanity, is like toxic waste. And we have overshot ourselves by many times. And we haven't learned our lessons. And I think that, things are going to be coming home to roost. There's a lot of stuff that's already baked in, and nothing can really get around that heating. And what happens after that, it's hard to say because so many things are going to break apart, you know. So it's kind of hard to say how it's going to look as it falls apart. But I saw in that article that they only went up to like 3 degrees, and fires were like everywhere. Well, what's going to happen if it goes up to 3 degrees? Because I believe it will. I don't know about you guys.
Well, the the models that I've been looking at, when they just examine the data and fit it into the differential equations, et cetera, is that the range of increased temperature and the range of warming by the end of this century is in the range of 5 to 11 C. And so then the question becomes, why is that range from 5 to 11? And it really comes down to, how do you model water vapor? How do you model the aerosol masking effect? Those two parameters are extremely difficult to get a handle on, and extremely difficult to adequately uh, incorporate into a model. I mean, for example, let's just take clouds, and Nick's the meteorologist, so correct me if I, if I make an erroneous statements here. But using the top of a cloud, you have an albedo, so you would have a reflectance of heat energy back into space, where the bottom of the clouds will trap the heat. And of course, a lot depends on the type of clouds. But one cloud that type of cloud that a lot of these models look at are the stratocumulus clouds. And they're saying that if you start getting temperatures above 1.5 or 1.8, whatever, that the stratocumulus clouds may not even, they'll just break apart. They may not even form in the first place. So that may allow more heat energy to be, because you don't have the top of the clouds reflecting the heat back to space, it's going to allow more heat energy to reach the surface. So water vapor is an extremely difficult parameter to get a handle on. And then there's the aerosol masking effect. So, and how do you handle that? There's some, basically the data indicates that if you stop putting greenhouse gas emissions into the atmosphere, which means you're also reducing the sulfur particulate matters, that the sulfur particulate matter is a cooling effect. Now you remove that, you allow for more warming, and the talking of that's at least 0.5 C. So whether you burn fossil fuels or not burn fossil fuels, you're almost guaranteeing more warming either way. So this is an example of how it's kind of, it's like damned if you do, damned if you don't. It's going to be extremely difficult to reverse, and I don't think it is reversible, to be quite honest. But that's why you see that range of value. But either way you look at it, even if you take the low end, the 5C, then we're screwed.
Yeah, and I think you have to contrast that, Sandy. If you can bring up the graph that we were outlining with the SSPs from the IPCC that project where we'll be out in the future. So this is the graph here. Now, what this graph is trying to illustrate is essentially what our emissions pathway will look like throughout the century. Now, what the IPCC is saying is that we are essentially on SSP 3-7.0 or SSP 7.0. Now, this SSP corresponds roughly to the lower bound of RCP 8.5. So essentially, what the IPCC is saying is that we are on a pathway that gets us by the end of the century to 3.5 to roughly 5 degrees Celsius on this pathway. Now, what the SSP model doesn't do is interpolate any type of dynamic feedback. So changes in cloud composition, cloud makeup or structure would not be imposed in these models. Dynamic changes in ocean circulation would not be imposed in these models. So these models are meant to only parameterize what the human input on the climate will be. And so that's why I don't say that they're wrong, because they're, in some ways, that's not their goal, or that's not their parameters. They're not sophisticated enough, actually, to tell us that. In fact, there are no such models. And that's why I think with Jim, and I'm imagining that Jim can tell us what class of models that he's referring to, but oftentimes the models I refer to, the SIMP, have us somewhere between 5 to 7 degrees Celsius by the end of the century. And the SIMP models do try to interpolate some feedbacks. But as stated before, feedbacks are very dynamic. It's very hard to say that if we warm the planet to 2 degrees by, let's say, 2040, that we'll have a specific reaction by then that will contribute a specific amount of heat. And because that's so difficult to do, that's often not done at all. And so I think the best way to think about it, if you're looking at IPCC models, they cannot give you an accurate depiction of the totality of the Earth system. You cannot get that from the IPCC models. The IPCC models can only tell you, well, if humans put this much CO2 in the atmosphere, and if you exclude looking at feedback dynamics, this is roughly what we think the temperature change will be. This is roughly how many fires we think will occur as a response to that, sea level rise, extreme weather events, so forth and so on. So I think what's important to get from this, though, is that even when you don't include those feedbacks, it appears that our trajectory is getting more aggressive, which again is cause for great concern, because we really haven't activated dynamic feedbacks yet. And even before then, our own human contributions are aggressively warming the planet in ways that are creating impacts that are more severe than we had expected.
No, the models that I'm looking at are ones that are developed by PIK, which is out of Potsdam, Germany. They tend to, well, they don't use a lot of the models that the IPCC uses. So in their modeling, they are trying to incorporate the interactions. They're trying to incorporate the positive feedback loops, for example, taking in the continual thawing of the permafrost, and now they're also looking at, they're starting to incorporate more and more of the oceanic data for with the warming ocean, the upper surface layer, the diffusion, the impact on the shelf system in the Arctic Ocean, and what it's doing to the methane deposits there. So they're looking at that. And so they're the ones that come up, and there's a lot of different researchers there, but they're the ones that seem to be coming up with this 5 to 11. And again, I go back to my earlier point about the water vapor and the AME being extremely difficult to get a handle on. And that's why we get, depending on how they treat those parameters, is why they get that range of 5 to 11. But even if you just go with the low end of it, that's still not good, as you just said. Sure. But they're really working on it, and they did this huge paper that looked at not just, what does temperature do, what does water, the fires do, the drought. they looked at everything. They looked at, AMOC, the Amazon, ENSO. I mean, they looked at all these different cycles and tried to put it together. Sometimes there was when there's an interaction between some of these tipping elements, there might have been a slight mitigation, a slight reduction in what the projected warming would be. Other cases, they exacerbate, they increase each other so that the overall net is even higher than expected. And then when you just take it all in toto, that's when they stated that a 1.3 C increase is basically just like, all hell breaks loose, literally and figuratively. So that's why we see that range, that's why I report on that range of 5 to 11, because I'm looking at the models coming out of a PIK.
Mm.
And that
So
sounds about
ultimately, it's going to be a lot worse than we thought it was going to be. I mean, 5 degrees C.
That's what
When does that
that's what they're
happen,
warning.
Jim?
Well, the projection is that by around 2100, it'll be somewhere from 5 to 11 warming from pre-industrial. So the
Wow.
5C, what they're saying is, at when 2100 arrives or thereabouts, the planet will be warmer by 5 to 11 C in that realm.
Yeah.
and that's very
I mean, 2 to 3 C is, you're starting to look at like truly like profound effects on ecosystems and agricultural production. I mean, like, goodness, 3C in particular starts to get truly horrifying. So, I mean, 5, 6C, I mean, you start having like parts of the world that are just way too hot to be inhabited by anyone. Not because of dry heat, because of increasing humid heat with very high wet bulb temperatures. So
Right.
I mean, I've read one paper from like, it was in I think it was the early 2010s, that actually modeled 10C, and I mean much of the planet has wet bulb temperatures that are getting so high that humans can't survive across wide swaths of where people currently live. So I mean, 10C is I mean, that's civilization probably ends long before 10C, to be quite honest.
Yeah.
But 10C is unimaginable. And I mean, that's the thing with this, trying to like understand how the climate system changes will actually affect human ability to survive on this planet, because you're trying to figure out, okay, like, how resistant can societies actually be to those changes? And that's the adaptability issue. Like, how far can you push and punch at social political systems before, with these changes that affect not only obviously the actual like environment in terms of temperature, moisture, things like that, the actual values of these things in the atmosphere, these variables of the atmosphere, but the effects they have on the ecological systems and agricultural systems that people depend on to feed themselves, be able to feed societies. And those are tipping points too. Those are social tipping points that nobody really truly knows where those are, because you could have, more vulnerable societies collapse because they're unable to handle them, and then those people have to go somewhere. They have to go elsewhere because they either can't live because the climate has become so severe, or the social political systems have collapsed and they can't get what they need through the economy anymore, through economic activity. So they have to go elsewhere where the economies are better and the social systems are better. But then you're dealing with a crisis where, are people going to let them in? Those will be the climate refugees. And it's scary, because you see what goes on even in these events that are going on right now, like in Ukraine. I've heard stories about how Black African immigrants that are going to school in Ukraine have tried to cross into Poland or to some other countries and have had trouble getting in because of alleged racism against them. They're letting in
Mhm.
the Ukrainian citizens, but they're giving the African immigrants or students more problems to get in. You know,
Yeah.
and people are alleging
Yeah.
racism against the African immigrants. And I mean, I've heard stories about Africans being treated poorly when they go to China or something too, and I and and it's one of those things where uh, in like humanitarian crises where there's this protracted these protracted events that affect lots of groups of people or certain groups of people, and they spread out, and they're spreading to places that aren't being directly affected by those, say, wars or famines or whatever. Then people start getting really picky about who they want to pick and choose to come in based on their preconceived notions of who they are. And as climate migration worsens, that those problems are going to increase. And there is no global government that can dictate to a country when they have to let somebody in and when they don't. It's the choice of the countries. And that means there could be people that are left behind to suffer because some government makes an arbitrary decision. Oh, we don't want to let those people in. It may have nothing to do with the resources that they have to provide to those people. In some cases it will, but in other cases it might be just, we don't want to let in the Africans, or no, we don't want to let in this ethnic group. We had a war with them 10 years ago. We don't want to deal with them in our country. It could be something completely arbitrary. They make up some story about why they can't let them in. I mean, yes, what we're dealing with here in America with immigrants, undocumented workers and immigrants coming in from Central and South America. We make up 10,000 excuses why we don't like them, but we let in others we have no problem with.
Mhm.
So that's going to get a lot worse. And the tribalism of humans, that doesn't magically go away because of the climate crisis. That's something that's pre-existing, and that will continue to potentially have significant problems on the ability of people to escape areas that are becoming increasingly more challenging to live because of repeated or protracted disasters and the effects on the social, political, and ecological systems of those places that they were living. So,
and to build on a point you just made, Nick, about what happens when it warms up to 3°C. The report that we're discussing tonight, they show quite starkly what the very horrible thing that will bring. And getting warm at 4 or 5 or whatever, I mean, is the, the disaster is just going to be, it will result in massive reduction of the number of humans on this planet. Let's put it that way. And
Mm.
another aspect as to why 5 to 11C is because the models that the folks at PIK are utilizing, they're going with exponentiation because hello, that's what the data, that's what the data fits. And think about it, 5 to 11C, that's basically halfway to a little more than halfway towards PETM levels of this planet.
Mm.
It's just to put that out there. And that was what, 53 million years ago, Hothouse Earth. It took how many millions of years to get Hothouse Earth, and we're doing it in a couple of centuries. So the scale
Yeah.
is staggering.
Well, that's the thing, the magnitude and I guess how quickly we're entering into this sixth great extinction as compared to prior extinctions that have happened on this planet, the Permian and, the PETM and all these other ones, it was much more gradual. And we are aggressively entering into this sixth grade extinction fueled pretty much all by human civilization of various stripes. And it's just got so much inertia to it, and there's so much that's already baked in. And because we're entering into it with so much force, who knows what else we could kick off? You know,
Yeah.
Hello there.
what
It's
comes to mind are the methane reservoirs.
right. I didn't mean to interrupt, but
Hello.
we have questions. And I'm behind the curtain tonight, everyone. And how would you like to handle the questions? We have several. Would you like me to put them up and read them, or can you read them? I don't know if you can see them.
No, I can't read them. Could
Okay,
you read them?
I certainly will. And feel free to choose out of yourselves who would like to take the question. And the first one I am going to read is from Mark Trewick. And he says, has El Nino got the potential to become permanent? What's to say that the transition doesn't begin from the La Nina stage, building up into a permanent El Nino by stealth, so to speak?
Nick or Jim, I think you guys would
Yeah.
be the best to answer
I mean,
that.
I know a little bit about El Nino. You'll probably know more, Jim. But from what I've heard, as far as climate change, I think they're maybe more concerned about El Nino becoming a permanent state, more at like 3 or 4 C in terms of global warming, just from the heating of the ocean and weakening of the currents, leading to that pool of warm water building up and just becoming part of a permanent state of El Nino. I haven't heard anything recently about it, though.
Okay, Lorax tribe. Unless, Jim, you wanted to. Oh, wait a minute. What happened to Jim? We can't hear you, Jim.
Oh.
Let me see something.
Hello?
Okay,
Yeah, we
now
can
you're
hear you.
here.
Oh, we got you.
Yeah.
Yeah,
All right, start over.
Okay. If I may, there are indications of those who study ENSO that there is a trend towards a permanent El Nino of the ENSO cycle. Instead of having the breakdown from El Nino to La Nina, you may have instead staying in the El Nino, perhaps sliding towards more of a neutral state of the ENSO cycle. But don't forget, as we continue to heat up the upper layers and as stratification increases, you're going to basically lock in those warmer surface waters, so that it's going to depress the pycnocline, depress that cold water from upwelling towards the surface. So yes, looking at the ocean heat content, looking at the heat being absorbed and continues to be absorbed, yeah, the indications are that we are headed towards a permanent El Nino, which will exacerbate the warming. Because don't forget, you got warmer oceans and you got warmer atmosphere. The warmer atmosphere can then suck up more of that moisture from the oceans, which then gets dumped on land, with major precipitation event and so on. I mean, we know the retinue on that, but yeah, that's what the indications are.
Okay. I have next one is Lorax tribe. And the question, do you think current oil situation will impact any shift in global energy policy? Example, voluntary support for solar, electric, or RWSF? That's a good question.
I think in
Antonio.
general,
Yeah.
I think in general, higher energy prices will lead to a more demand of substitutes for those higher prices. So, in that sense, I think it will contribute somewhat to more development of solar, wind, and more in particular electric cars. How long the prices stay high will impact that more. So, in some sense, you would think that higher energy prices mean, yes, in the short run, corporations will benefit more, but the people who are paying those prices don't want to pay at a premium, so they're going to try to find substitutes. So, actually, the most dangerous thing, in some sense, it's good that energy prices are going high if you're kind of hoping that in the absence of robust government action, at least the market will respond to the higher energy prices. Of course, it'll be much too late in that sense. But I think that's likely to be the big spin. Now, if energy prices crash, then we go back to pre-crisis. We just continue as we were. So those are the type of futures. I think the worst possible thing that can come out of this is, as we were discussing before, is that if the oil industry and their lobbyists get what they want, right? So if they sell the lie that we need to build out terminals to lower energy prices today, and everybody says, drill, baby, drill, that's American, that's pro-America. Now, if we do that, two things will happen. Nothing the energy prices. And then second, we'll be locking in that oil infrastructure for decades. So actually, this is again a pivotal moment, because actually what direction that we decide to go will matter for the next several years. If you've ever read Naomi Klein's shock doctrine, that's similarly what's happening here, is that we're having a shock to the system. And there are two forces in the energy sector that are trying to dominate. Now, all they have to do is win the day. And if they win the day, they'll win for decades. Because like I say, when it comes to these energy infrastructures, they're built out and leased out for decades, 30, 40, 50 years at a time. So it's actually kind of crucial that we don't let them levy their way around this.
Mm.
Okay. I want to go back to Gary Hoover. His question, well, first he was saying, what did Jim Massa say? Best fits the data. He was attending to something in the chat. And then he actually, I don't know if you remember what you were saying, but then he said, so again, by 2100, 5 to 11C, we are almost all dead by 2C and all dead by 3C, right? And then he also, then this leads into his big question. Is IPCC honest about this 1.1 degree rise so far? Just yes or no. Explain, please. Seems like a propaganda change, not a real change in science. So I'm giving you Gary. Gary, you better still be here.
Well, I'll say no. And in my capacity when I, worked in climate change, I had to deal with the IPCC because we were preparing reports. Of course, we were concentrating on the Arctic. That's where I worked. And, I did sea ice. And sea ice didn't used to make it into the reports. So, selective, editing, I guess you could say. I have major problems with the methodology of the IPCC, not just in the modeling that they use. I mean, I know Antonio has explained very well, why they use the methodologies they do. I do not think it's an accurate reflection. I also have problems with them constantly changing the baseline from which to make comparisons. So if you were to go back to 1750, which used to be the baseline IPCC used, and if you compare to that baseline, not oh, let's take it from 1850 to 1910, which is the current. I think they keep moving the goalpost. If you go back to 1750, then the warming is actually over 1.5 already. And by the way, when you look at a lot of what's on the NOAA website, they use 1750 as the baseline. In fact, when they calculate their annual greenhouse gas index, they use 1750 as the baseline for their calculations. So the 1.1C, that to me is just moving the goalposts, and they're trying to make it not sound as bad when it really is higher and it really is bad. So,
Well, if I can add a little bit of just clarification. So the indexing for emissions is 1750 because we have a much better record of what our emissions were than we do of what the temperature rise corresponding to those emissions were. And the reason why we got that is because we have really good inventories for the amount of material we began to burn in that time. And Jim, I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, but in totality, saying that the Earth is, let's say that it's 1.5 degrees Celsius warmer than 1750, that is the same as saying it's 1.2 degrees Celsius warmer than 1880. Jim, can you hear me?
Mm-hmm.
Did we lose? But that's the I think we lost Jim's audio
We
again.
can't hear him. Can't hear him. He can't see me.
Okay. So that's the point that I guess I'm trying to make clear is that I don't think that the IPCC is moving the baseline. That the reason why IPCC chooses, and remember, the IPCC is the most conservative organization on the planet when it comes to understanding or communicating climate change science. And in order to, in some sense, that means they have to meet the lowest common denominator among the scientists, right? And so in order to do that, the best science says the most reliable data as far back as we can go is 1880. It's not that we don't have data that goes back to 1750. We do, and we can actually reconstruct a lot of that data. But if you want the most best data, that's the least reconstructed, the furthest back in time, all those qualifications, you go to the 1880 baseline, which is only 1.2. Now, it is upon the audience to be smart, right? Because the audience can look at any baseline and you can tack on the additional degrees. Because what the baseline is saying is not what has been the total amount of climate change. It's saying this is how much climate change has occurred since this period of time, right? So you can take a 2000 baseline, but having a 2000 baseline doesn't mean you're trying to fool people about climate change. It just means that you're trying to look at how much climate change has specifically occurred since 2000 to present. And that's important, right? It's important to know not only how much climate change is happening in totality, but how much climate change is happening from different periods. So if I wanted to know, for example, how much has the climate warmed since I was born, I can go to the NASA website and I can create my own baseline from 1993 and see exactly how much the planet's warmed since I've been here. But that doesn't mean that I've manipulated the climate change baseline. That's only just trying to explain how much the warming has occurred since I've been here.
Yeah, but see, first of all, can you guys hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Can you hear me? Oh, okay.
Yeah.
I mean, it's just my mic's been cutting in and out, or whatever. Okay. The thing is, though, these reports are presented to politicians, and politicians aren't savvy enough to make those distinctions that you just made. However, I'm going to push back a little bit and say that, our analytical analyses and techniques have greatly improved with a massive reduction in the errors, so that we can actually, with very high confidence, recreate our climate back 65 million years ago, basically the KPG event. I mean, that's how greatly our techniques, a lot of it is isotopic, has vastly improved. So the reason why 1750 is typically used is because that's kind of recognized as the start of the Industrial Revolution. Now, when the Industrial Revolution perhaps really got underway, might have been another century or so. For example, all the coal factories in the UK, what have you. Be that as it may, but it's generally 1750 gives us a good, faces like this is when humans really started to put more CO2. This is when we start seeing the increases of CO2 in the atmosphere, and for that matter, the AME. Between ice cores, dendrology, sediment cores, all this stuff, and all these other analytical methods, we can really reconstruct our climate very well. Now, to your point, that if you want to know what has happened since pick a year, fair enough. I mean, but if you want to say, okay, overall, be consistent in your methodology. That's my issue. Now, you can say, all right, from 1750 to present day, this is it. From 1850 to present day, this is it. Or if you want to say from 1910 to present day, this is it. But it needs to be specified in the methodologies. And I don't
Jim,
really see it being specified.
And Jim, let me say this though: the reason why I think 1880 is boiled upon as well is because you got to also remember that as humans are developing our civilization, we kind of stumble upon these things, like, for example, keeping sea gauges. And one of the things that we start doing, but we kind of start doing it later in the Industrial Revolution, is keeping temperature records. And so the reason why 1880 is the year that's kind of collectively agreed upon is because that is where we have pretty much actual temperature readings from everywhere in the planet except for the Arctic and Antarctica. And so it's not just about climate reconstruction, because climate is general, but we actually have temperatures from those zones in those years. So that's why that's preferred in their methodology. Now, I do agree with you, because I just read the summary for policymakers, and it's 37 pages. They do not explain that they're not really using a pre-industrial baseline, that you do have to tack on additional degrees when you are looking at their graphs. Now, that is, of course, quite unfortunate, because, like you say, the whole idea is that we're supposed to be advising policymakers, so leaving out the fact that actually the planet is perhaps anywhere between 0.2 to 0.5 of a degree warmer is quite significant.
Okay. Well, I'm going to go on to the next question, and I hope I didn't lose it. Okay, Mila. Yes, this is from Mila, and welcome, Mila, if you're still here. Mila asks, can someone on the panel comment on the impact of thermal heat generated by atomic energy, including but not limited to discharging superheated H2O in oceans, rivers, and lakes? That's pretty heavy sounding. Impact of thermal heat.
Well, if I'll handle the aquatic end of things. maybe Nick can
atomic
handle.
energy.
maybe Nick can handle the atmospheric aspects, but obviously, if you dump superheated water into water systems, that ain't good. I mean, you're gonna literally cook the organisms. I mean, a lot of organisms, especially in oceanic systems, are what we call as stenothermal. They can only tolerate a narrow range of temperatures. If you're in an estuary or riverine system, you might be more eurythermal. You can handle a wider range, but still, if you throw in superheated water, it's a major shock to the system, and you're going to see a bunch of floaty bloaty fishes on the surface. Is what the end result will be.
Okay, I
I mean,
wondered
the
if she was
scales are
oh,
also
sorry.
different too. It's going to be drastically different in terms of dispersal of that heat. If it's going directly into an
Sure.
ocean versus if it's going directly into a river or a small lake, it's going to be quite devastating for a much smaller scale system for the same
Exactly.
amount of heat that you're releasing into that environment.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. It's like everything else, diffusion rates and so forth.
Okay, the next Wolf final. Okay, everyone is spot on. Perhaps the group can expand on how individuals can evaluate and act to reduce their environmental and climate risks as things accelerate. Great question. And that was also Gary's other question. So let's take it away on what do you do?
Well, I think that everybody has to. First of all, let's talk about the least you can do. Let's always start with the least you can do. The least you can do is vote for people who are conscious of the climate crisis and want to do something. That is literally the least you can do. Now that we've all gotten past that, because 50% of Americans won't do that. The next thing that we ought to be doing is obviously communicating to each other about the nature of the crisis, um, and preparing our neighborhoods and our communities for resiliency. And resiliency looks like a lot of things. One of the things that we had to learn here, thanks to the environmental crisis we had, was our storm runoff water systems. You know, we had to reevaluate those. We had to make sure that we wanted to separate contaminated water from drinking water supplies. We had to build new reservoir systems, and we actually had to do new dam construction as well, not for like electricity or power, but just as water redirection and redistribution. So those are things that can happen at the local level. Returning a lot of your asphalt. One of the things we're going to talk about in our suburban episode, but returning a lot of the asphalt parking lots into green lands and green materials and greenways, reducing the amount of impermeable materials, increasing the amount of tree cover in your cities. Of course, using different energy sources. If you're able to purchase battery technology for your home or solar technology for your home, those things will also help. But the biggest thing that you can do is push your federal and state government to make huge changes in their energy mix. If they're able to do that, that also makes obviously your job at home easier, because then you won't have to buy a solar panel because your energy will be coming from renewable sources on a grid scale. That's another thing that we could be doing, is that we could be developing a smart grid that will help easily distribute our energy generation needs when we need it. So there's a lot of things that we can be doing at the municipal level, at the state level, and at the federal level, and we have to be doing these things if we want any chances to survive.
Yeah, and I would add that, add to that. I mean, in order to, you know, in order to address, a lot of these, challenges, it really, it can't, it's not really for something as huge as climate change, because it has so many effects on the natural environment and leading into society. It has to be something that's addressed at a community level, jurisdictional level, um, uh, in turn, and be able to actually make these very important changes. And we talk about like um, risk reduction strategies, and it's not just about building dams and doing these like infrastructure work to reduce the risk of damage. It's also about um, taking care of people to make it easier for them to be able to actually handle hazard events, because the hazard events are still going to happen. And we know, as we've talked about on the show, that there are certain characteristics of the climate system that are baked in for at least the next 20, 30 years in terms of warming of the planet. And so we're going to get either more frequent or more intense meteorological, hydrologic events. And so when you deal with, when you know that you have um, members of your society that have you know less money, more food insecurity, um, more difficulty with access to aid, either or access to information, period, to help them be able to prepare or respond or recover from disasters, either because of social or political disenfranchisement. I mean, there's issues based on race, issues based on class, issues based on rural versus urban, access to resources, access to money, access to um, um, technological resources. And a lot of times infrastructure gets neglected. It gets neglected in cities. It gets neglected even worse in rural areas. You have all of these um, they've been called vulnerabilities, but they're really aspects of society that are not that are where people are neglected, and therefore they're left with a greater level exposure to the potential hazards that that particular jurisdiction or community faces. And to get to the heart of that will really require um, the ability of people, individuals, neighborhoods, and there any representative organizations, community organizations that have a focus on particular neighborhoods or ethnic groups or whatever, to really get to the heart of, and also electing political leaders that care about those issues to get together to actually address those issues and take them seriously. Because, as I said, those are routine problems. Those are routine issues that affect people every single day. And when you have disasters and catastrophes, those things are going to be magnified. Those problems, those issues of vulnerabilities are going to be magnified significantly. And those people are going to have more, be impacted worse, and have greater needs, and will be at greater risk of dying or being left behind in the wake of those disasters. So you have to be able to you have to learn how to take care of people and allow those who have the least voice to have a much greater voice, and being able to address their needs now before things get worse.
Okay, thank you very much. Now, truly aghast, my favorite name. Can Nick talk a bit about VOAD, VOAD, before we end? Is it something average citizens can get involved in?
Oh, so I meant so she saw this on my Facebook page. So my department at North Dakota State University posted a thing about me and what I was working on in the department. And one of the things I was doing is I'm working on with my advisor is a manuscript we did on a research study related to Voads. They're voluntary agencies active in disasters, and basically um, they're and they exist in all 50 states, or state level Voads exist in all 50 states and in the also the U.S. territories, and they are a collaboration of mostly nonprofit organizations. So you think about the Red Cross or the Salvation Army, but also other various nonprofit organizations. Some of them can be secular or religious oriented, but they're all together to try to plan for helping people, for first responders and also victims of disasters, and in terms of preparedness and recovery activities in the wake of disasters. And these organizations were developed as a means to uh, try to reduce duplication of efforts, because it was in the wake of Hurricane Camille in 1969, where the sort of the VOAD movement initiated in the wake of that disaster. There were a lot of problems where nonprofits were duplicating the efforts, doing some of the same tasks, and not communicating or coordinating with each other or with the government, local or regional governments, to be able to do things. And there were people that were left behind, didn't get the resources that they need, and their needs being addressed because of the lack of communication and coordination between organizations. So the VOAT movement came to being in the wake of Camille, and you have a national VOAT, the sort of an umbrella group, and then 56 state and territorial VOADs, and they work within their states to be able to give opportunities for nonprofits, and in a few states there's also businesses involved as well, or government liaisons, state government liaisons, and they are involved in doing this work of networking, staying in continuous contact with each other, and making plans for disaster events, and being able to help counties and communities get the resources that they need through nonprofits in the wake of disasters. Because in the U.S., nonprofits do a lot of the recovery work. It's not the government. Government don't in the U.S. doesn't do very much. It's mostly nonprofits that have a lot of the work thrown at them. They're a significant sector in the U.S., but they're highly varied in terms of their strength, in terms of what they do, in terms of what they can provide. But there's so much variety in what different nonprofits do. That's why the government, throws the bone at them and say you can handle recovery, but even though they may not always have the resources to do all the work that they need to do, and they get really strained the bigger the event. So there's definitely weaknesses in how the U.S. handles recovery operations in terms of rebuilding and reshaping people's lives to be able to bounce back from disaster events. But as far as people getting involved, it's an multi-organizational structure. So really, if you want to be involved in anything the VOADs do, it's really being involved in the individual nonprofits, volunteering your time for a nonprofit that you support, or you think you support the mission of and what they do, and that gives that nonprofit the strength to then be able to participate with other nonprofits and stay in contact, hopefully with the governments that care to be able to do the work that they can do when a disaster hits. But yeah, that's basically what that is in a nutshell.
Very nice. Jennifer's back, and I want to know if you guys want any more questions. It's an hour and 45. Jen, take it away. Can't hear you.
about now?
We got you.
Perfect, babe.
Yeah? Okay. Well, I think that's a healthy length for a show, an hour and 45 minutes. So I'm kind of in favor for wrapping it up.
Yeah.
Sounds good to me. It was a good show. I had to get up a billion times because my son was acting up, and then I had to get my charger because my computer died. It was fun. I guess everyone kind of had issues tonight with sound and everything, so why not me?
Didn't pay the electric bill, Nick?
Well,
All right, then. Good night, everyone. Even though you can't see me, I am the producer behind the curtain tonight. And let's say thank you. Thank
Thanks
you,
to
Nick.
everyone
Jennifer.
for being here.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Yeah, it was fun.
yeah.
Fun as dire news can be, right? Yeah.
It is what it is, right?
Right.